Welcome to another episode of Dreamers, Drivers, and Doers. I'm Steve Millard with the Greater Akron Chamber, and in this podcast, I get to talk to people who are really making a difference for a business, locally, regionally, sometimes nationally. And today is one of those days I get to talk to somebody who is working really across the scope of the United States as it relates to policy, advocacy, and work on behalf of our small and mid-sized businesses. Please help me welcome Todd McCracken, who is the president and CEO of the National Small Business Association. Welcome, Todd.
Thanks, Dave. It's great to be here.
So, Todd, we've known each other for a really long time, maybe 25
Yep.
years or so, and have interfaced as we've both been working on behalf of business in the policy space. Talk a little bit about the National Small Business Association and sort of who you are, maybe how you came to be and the work that you do. And I'll start by just underlining you are not a government entity, right?
We are not. Sometimes people think we are the Small Business Administration, but we are, in fact, the National Small Business Association, a private entity. And we are what we sound like, a national association of small companies that advocates on behalf of free enterprise, the small business community, and policies that will help small companies start, grow, and succeed. But it is really actually nice to be talking to you all today because we've been based here in Washington, D.C. since the 1940s. We are the oldest national small business organization in the country. We actually were founded in Ohio, and we are to this day an Ohio corporation. But more to the point, we actually were founded in Akron, Ohio. A printer by the name of DeWitt McKinley Emery had a letterhead company in Akron, and he founded this organization in 1937 in the depths of the Great Depression. And so, yeah, it's great to sort of call back to our roots here.
Just another kid from Akron, right? I mean, just another
right.
Person doing good.
Yep.
So, talk about a little bit. So, you're an advocacy is a key part. You're a membership organization. When you talk about small businesses, what are you talking about? How do you guys think about them, define them, the core constituency for your work?
I sometimes jokingly say, when people ask me, how do you define small business? I sometimes say, well, it depends on why you ask. And that's always kind of a joke because while for membership purposes, we define companies as small if they have fewer than 500 employees. The vast majority of our members have far fewer than that. In fact, the average is less than 20 employees. But really, it depends on the issue we work on, right? Because if we're working on a labor issue that requires companies to comply to really have an HR function, the reality is companies usually don't have a dedicated HR function until they have around 15 or 20 employees.
Okay.
And so that makes it easier for them to comply. For another issue like access to capital or some other mandate, this sort of what makes a small business unique might be at a different size. So it really does vary in terms of where we put our emphasis on the companies we're trying to help. It is sort of issue by issue. But for membership and all the rest, it's 500 employees and less.
Yeah, the thing that I always find interesting about this is that, the SBA definition, for the federal government is 500 employees or less. But if I asked you what percentage of all businesses in the country are 500 employees or less, it's probably up in the 90s, right?
It's like 99% of companies have
right.
fewer than 500 employees. But that's only because there are just so many small companies, right? There's millions of small businesses.
But I think it's fair to say, in my experience with you guys, you're working on issues that Main Street businesses, manufacturers, folks that aren't big scale enterprises really have concerns around. Most of your members don't have dedicated lobbyists. Most of your members aren't working in this space every day. And so policy and government affairs and those things are not the norm for these companies.
Right. That's exactly right. But so we try to work on issues that cut across small companies. So, there are, of course, industry groups and sectoral groups that focus on the niche issues of particular sectors or industries. We try to work on those things like tax policy, labor issues, healthcare reform to bring down the cost of health insurance, for instance, the things that are of concern to a broad swath of the small business community.
So one of the things I also have experienced in working with your organization over time and being at the events that you put on is you're working with owners. I mean, there are,
Hmm.
there's lots of people who make small businesses work, but the constituency that I see often at NSBA events, the folks who are getting engaged in conversations are the people who are, most at risk driving these small businesses, are making payroll and are getting it done every day. It's not a bunch of professional sort of functionaries that are sort of at these events.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's who our members are, really. Technically, it's the business that's the member because we are a trade association, not a professional association. Nevertheless, it really is the owners that are engaged as the representative of those companies in the organization. And they're who we get our marching orders from. I mean, as I'm sure you know, sitting here in DC, there are lots of organizations and entities that are completely staff controlled. They may do their best to represent a constituency, but it really is the paid professionals in DC that call pretty much all the shots. And that's not NSBA. While we have professional staff that uh, where we try to figure out the best approach for our advocacy, when it comes down to what are our priorities, what are our stands, what are we working on, that really is up to the members, our all small business board of trustees, the committees that we have that again that are popular with small business owners and leaders from across the country, and that's one of the things that I think really makes us different in this world, especially in Washington.
Yeah, I find that also kind of refreshing. Actually, we go into these discussions in DC, and I'd love you to talk about the way in which your members get involved in the work. But sometimes it's not pretty, right? You have folks who come to these events, and you're doing policy development, you're doing conversations about tough issues, and they've got real things that are impacting their business, and might not always be the most polite or most sophisticated lobbyists for their cause. But I got to tell you, it feels like our elected officials get a real dose of what small businesses are dealing with.
No, I think that's exactly right. We bring real live people to policymakers, and that's I think really refreshing. Is they need to understand that there's not always a high gloss on things out there. That folks have real issues. They uh, don't always have time to pretty things up, and they're pretty direct with policymakers, which um, sometimes we got to go over and patch some things up
Right,
behind
right.
the scenes. But I think in on balance, it is really great for both the organization, for the cause, and for the policymakers to hear the sort of the real deal from real small business owners.
So would you say your members are a bunch of Republicans, a bunch of Democrats, a bunch of independents or libertarians? How do you kind of break from an ideological
They
standpoint?
they are everything. I mean, if we actually do a politics survey every year actually every other year in election years of the members, just kind of say, who are you all? What are you thinking politically? And they really are all over the place. We have more Republicans than Democrats, but we have a substantial number of Democrats, and we don't have a majority of any particular persuasion. Lots of independents. Um, and what I'm not quite sure what our secret sauce is, but we try to stay nonpartisan. And for the most part, in our meetings, at our board meetings, our conferences, um, we are. And you realize you come into the meetings, and we have people there who are very conservative, people who are more liberal or progressive, people in the middle of the road. But when we start talking about the practical small business issues, the issues that are really facing uh, entrepreneurs and real companies across the country, you realize that there's a lot of commonality, and people are able to sort of, for the most part, set aside the ideology or axes to grind they walked into the room with, and really reach consensus. And I wish we could figure out how to share that
Right.
recipe with the rest of the country sometimes. But when I do, maybe I'll make a mint. But
There you go.
it's really refreshing to work in this organization and see that happen.
Well, I think, the common denominator there, right, is they're all owners, they're all at risk at some level, they're all trying to make a payroll, and they're all sometimes confused about what the heck is going on, right? And they don't
Right.
they don't deal with this stuff every day. So I think that creates a great foundation for collaborative conversation. But talk about that process, because we were in DC not too long ago, as you were doing a very member-based process to set the agenda for NSBA over
Yeah.
the next congressional session. Talk about how that works and why that's important to you guys.
Well, we do that every 2 years at the beginning of a new Congress. As you know, the president gets reelected every 4 years, but the House of Representatives comes in anew every 2 years. And so they have 2 years to do their business before a new Congress comes in. So at the beginning of that process, we always have a policy conference where we try to lay out what small business priorities ought to be. And we bring small business leaders from all over the country, from all sectors together. And we spend, pretty much a whole day kind of in conversation, mostly with outside experts from across the spectrum, so they can hear what the real debates are on the issues here in DC, and engage in dialogue with those folks, and really kind of think through things, not just from the perspective of their own business, but from the sort of the national policy perspective, but then think about how that's going to affect real small businesses out there. And then the second day of the conference is kind of hashing through those and thinking about what some of the political realities are, what issues actually may move, may not move, and discussing what should be the highest priorities for the small business community, and then we ultimately vote on them. And out of that, we produce a sort of a top priority list for us to sort of, as an organization, sort of work from over the ensuing 2 years. Obviously, things change. There's the issues will arise that we hadn't expected that we need to deal with. Other issues that we thought we could make some progress on might go away for some reason. So, our board and staff have to be a little bit nimble, but I think that's a process that gives us a clear kind of roadmap for the things that are really important.
Well, and I think while it's a 2-day process in DC for folks, your team spends a lot of time putting the kind of summarizing the issues and putting the briefs together for folks to get smart, from really maybe not knowing a whole lot about the issues, which I think really gives a chance for people to talk about it and makes it, I don't know, I find your stuff to be approachable for people who are about running their business, but have an interest in policy or want to help sort of highlight the things that have to happen to make it a better environment to operate their business in.
Yeah, we try to cut to the chase, and the last couple of times for this conference, we get out a lot of the briefing materials well in advance, but we also had some virtual meetings in advance to kind of, for people who can't be in DC, to get their feedback from different regions, from different sectors of the economy, and also convened these issue committees that we have that are open to the members that meet quarterly. We convened them specifically so that we can funnel their feedback into this conference. So, the feedback arrives from lots of places, but the key thing is it's mostly not coming from inside the Beltway. It's coming from out in the real world.
Yeah, which is, where these issues are and what people have to sort of figure out. So help me understand a little bit about, maybe we'll take a speed walk through some of these issues, because this last conference, this last congressional agenda setting process, if you will, focused in on a few key issues. So maybe we can talk about what you see happening this year in some of these big areas that small businesses should be paying attention to. And I'll talk later on about how people can get more involved in this work. But let's talk about tax reform right now. Big year for taxes, I think, as the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sunset later this year. Talk about some of the things small business owners should be aware of as it relates to tax reform and how that's playing into other conversations about budgets and deficits, et cetera.
Yeah, well, it's a huge issue for tax policy, as you say, and that's because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that passed in 2017, a lot of the provisions are sunsetting at the end of this year. So if Congress does not act, they will go away. So that includes the 20% qualified business income deduction for pass-through entities. It includes the individual lowering of individual tax rates, and a bunch of other things that directly affect small companies, because they pay taxes as pass-throughs. Now, most of the corporate policies, the corporate tax breaks that were enacted in 2017, do not sunset. They will roll forward as is, unless Congress changes them. So
this is primarily focused, Todd, then on people who have LLCs, partnerships, sole proprietorships, which is they're the biggest forms of formation, big forms of businesses for small businesses, right?
Yeah, there are obviously quite a lot of C corporations that are small businesses, but the lion's share are these pass-throughs that you just described. Yes.
Okay.
So it's huge for them. Small companies are really the ones that are most on the hook this year. So we've been advocating for quite a while. We've been pretty successful, as you know, because of arcane rules, and mostly in the Senate, they can't pass these tax cuts without a filibuster unless they pass them through what's called a reconciliation bill. To do a reconciliation bill, you have to do a budget, pass an actual budget. You then, quote, reconcile your spending and tax bills to, which is what's called a reconciliation bill. So they've been spending a lot of time at the beginning of the spring to sort of pass those budgets. And now we're doing the hard work of actually drafting the bills. And there's a lot of controversy about how much is going to balloon the deficit, how much is tenable to balloon the deficit, how many spending cuts will be coming along with the tax cuts to sort of keep the deficit more in check. And that's sort of all the stuff that's in play right now. In addition to the stuff that happened in 2017 that we want to get extended for small companies, there are other things that have come up as well, things we want to correct from the 2017 law. One of those is the requirement that R&D expenses wind up getting amortized over 5 years, not deducted in the year in which the expense actually occurred, which is a priority for us. And that's a fix from the 2017 law that we need to get in there. And then, of course, since then, the president and others have championed causes such as eliminating tax on Social Security benefits and overtime workers, et cetera. So there are other things working their way in there too that folks are trying to fit into this omnibus bill.
So talk about for a second a little bit more about the R&D amortization issue. So the difference here for small businesses is the ability to take that expense sort of on an accelerated basis in 1 year versus having to spread it over 5 years. And that has an impact on small businesses, right? And their balance sheets and income statements.
Oh, it's enormous. I mean, obviously, a lot of small businesses don't take an R&D deduction, but for those who do, it can be this could kill them from a cash flow perspective, right? So you have a real outlay of cash in a given year, but essentially you can only deduct 20% of that this year, another 20% next year, even though you might have a whole bunch more expenses next year. And so you're paying taxes up front essentially on the amount on this money that you're unable to deduct. And if that's a significant amount of money, as it is for instance, companies that are part of the Small Business Innovative Research Program, most of what they do is R&D. And so if they can't deduct most of their business expenses in a given year, that's a significant hurdle from a cash flow perspective for those companies.
And they're paying taxes on dollars they don't have, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
we've been trying to get that fixed. That changed. That actually was part of a so-called pay for the tax cuts from 2017, right? So they did that essentially to bring more revenue into the government inside the budget window, and didn't think it would be that big a deal. Of course, it's a big deal. So that became fully effective in 2022. So since then, companies have not been able to deduct these R&D expenses. And while I think we have majority bipartisan support to restore it to what it was, now we're facing these budgetary pressures that might not enable those things to be retroactive. There have been support to make them retroactive to 2022, so that people, if they're still in business, can get their full money back. That's proving to be a little bit more of an uphill fight than it looked a couple of years ago.
That makes an already deep hole even deeper if we adjust it.
That's right.
This year. So talk for a second. Corporate Transparency Act is something that you guys have been very involved with from the start of it. Explain what it is. I think most folks have a sense of it if they're running a business because they've had to file, but you kind of have led the charge on this issue on behalf of small businesses.
Yeah, the Corporate Transparency Act passed at the very beginning as part of a bigger bill, bigger than 2021. And basically, we've been fighting it for years and managed to hold it off for a while, but ultimately it passed. And what it does is it requires all small companies, so companies for the most part with fewer than 20 employees and less than $5 million in revenue, and only those companies, those entities, to file pretty detailed information reporting with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a branch of Treasury, the Department of Treasury, and that are required to file lots of pretty detailed ownership information on what's called their, quote, beneficial owners. So they got to give basically where they live, who they are, their driver's license numbers, passport numbers, etc. And all this goes into a big database, ostensibly to combat money laundering. But we're pretty skeptical that even if fully enforced and complied with, that it would actually get us very far, because most of the criminals aren't going to report. But more deeply, there's a lot of confusion over what is a beneficial owner, because the beneficial owner can be anybody that they might not own any of the company, actually, in terms of real ownership rights. But if they have a substantial influence on a significant part of the company, then they can be considered a beneficial owner. That could be your father-in-law. It could be your IT company who's recommending, some significant technology that you need to be using. It could be your CPA. And so, while if you know who to report on and you have the information, filing the form with Vinson is not that big a deal. But figuring out all this stuff to figure out who you're filing for and making sure it's up to date, which is another requirement, is a real challenge.
And the penalties of not filing are pretty significant, right?
They can be up to 2 years in prison.
Huh.
Yeah,
that's
so
pretty
they're
significant.
inconsequential.
Yeah,
it's significant fines and potentially a felony prison term. So it's pretty significant. But the state of play is we filed a lawsuit with the district court, and it took a while, but we won that court. That case was decided in March of last year. Since that time, there were a whole bunch of what I'll call copycat cases. People basically, because we won, saw that it was winnable, so they basically copied and pasted our lawsuits and filed their own. And and some of those have come through now as well. Some haven't. But the bottom line is, after all this back and forth, our case is on appeal. Other cases are on appeal, but the bottom line right now for people is they don't have to file, because the administration basically said they're rewriting the rules, or have rewritten the rules, so that only foreign entities and foreign owners have to comply. So basically, U.S. domestics are out of this for now. Now, I will say our fight to get this law repealed goes on, both in the courts and in the legislature, for two reasons. One, this was being done via the federal agencies, not via the law. So the next administration, or even this administration, could change course on this at any point and get us back to where we were. And I think that's actually a likely outcome for a future administration.
Yeah. So
and secondly, what the administration has done here is going to be subject to lawsuits. It's not clear that under the Corporate Transparency Act as written, they actually are allowed to defer this reporting for domestic companies. And so I think that's going to get challenged. Now that'll take a minute to work its way through court, even if they lose. So there's not an urgency for people to file, but we're really concerned that we don't sort of lose the wind in our sails to get this thing addressed, either through the courts or through the Congress, because ultimately that's still what needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think this is a good example of one of those things that's in the background that maybe folks aren't paying enough attention to, and all of a sudden they realize, what? I've got to file this. I've got fines. I've got potential prison time. So appreciate the work you and your team have done to continue to fight this fight over the long term to on behalf of small businesses. So let's talk tariffs for a second. What are you seeing in the small, mid-sized business segment on tariffs? obviously they've had a chilling effect for some manufacturers. For others,
Mhm.
maybe it's positive because it takes their competition out of the game. But how are you seeing this play out right now? And what work are you doing on this on behalf of small and mid-sized businesses?
Well, a couple of things. Most companies, most small companies, aren't aren't directly importing and exporting, but there nevertheless are most of them are at some level in the supply chain here, right? So we actually have a survey in the field right now to figure out how people are being impacted. Um, Preliminary results and just sort of anecdotes I hear from talking to small businesses every day is actually the biggest issue right now is just sort of a level of uncertainty,
Yep.
right? That they're not sure what goods are going to cost. They're not sure what's going to happen. Um, and it's hard for them to think about how to approach the next opportunity, how to price a contract if they don't know what their inputs are going to cost in the near term. So, what we've been telling policymakers is that we need to sort of move past this period of uncertainty and lack of clarity, as quickly as we can, and get to a point where sort of people know what the rules of the road are, and can move forward, whether that is with tariffs or without, um, depending upon the country. We need to have a clear picture. That's the single thing that will help small businesses the most, because the worst thing is to be paralyzed and not know, um, whether to expand, whether to contract, whether to increase your prices and potentially, undercut your business, or the reverse. And it's really a, a frustrating period for lots of companies. Is what we're hearing.
I mean, one of the values of the great things about small businesses, we're resilient, right? We can sort of
Right.
adapt and change. But if the environment keeps changing and you can't hone in on anything, it has a chilling effect on what you can invest in and the strategy that you pursue. So I think great. Hopefully, I'm looking forward to seeing what those survey results come out and sort of tell us about what people are thinking. Hopefully, that can help our policymakers a little bit.
Yeah,
So
I hope
as
so.
we sort of wind toward the end of this, just anything else that came out of the agenda setting session that we haven't covered that you think is sort of a critical, pay attention to this space? We've got to be thinking harder about this from a policy perspective for small business.
The thing that I think we've worked on off and on for years is healthcare costs, and I really see that sort of moving up the chain again. I'm hearing a lot more from companies. It came up as one of our priorities at this session in February, and I just think a lot of companies are being increasingly hit with uh, insurance premiums that are escalating well beyond inflation. And given the other inflationary pressures that businesses have faced the last few years, I think it's becoming increasingly untenable. And I think that's really moving up the the priority list for the small business community very quickly. And while I don't think policymakers are ready to think about how to deal with healthcare again,
Yeah.
um, I think they need to start sharpening their pencils, because it's going to become, I think, an
Yeah.
increasing priority.
So one of the things that maybe NSBA helps owners with as well is understanding that they're not alone on some of this stuff. So you do a lot of research, a lot of surveys. Talk about some of the resources that might exist on your website where folks can get a sense of what their colleagues are seeing or what, kind of get some validation for some of their concerns, but also how they can learn about some more of these issues and policies and get engaged.
Yeah, we pretty much put everything on our website, so people should just visit it. It's at sbaadvocate.org, and we have all of our priority issues with detailed issue briefs on there. They can learn about those things. Our surveys that we do on a regular basis, this one I was just talking about, but we do a whole range of surveys in the small business community to provide information to policymakers. They're all up there. We do regular email updates on the issues, a weekly email newsletter to the members. But most of those news stories that go in that newsletter are also available on our website for people to use. So we don't see ourselves as an organization that's just about representing those thousands of companies that are direct members. We see our role as advocating for the small business community writ large. And so we need to get our information and policy positions out to the broadest possible audience all the time. So our website's not locked down, so I'd encourage people to go and learn what they can and let us know if they'd like to participate.
Well, we're proud as the Greater Akron Chamber and the Akron Canton Advocacy Alliance to really be working side by side with you to make sure that we're gathering perspectives from our small businesses. And so often we're kind of pushing out those same surveys that you're doing. And also a lot of that information that you're putting out there, we're trying to proactively put in front of our members. And so it's a really valuable resource and valuable information that you provide, Todd. But those members of ours who want to get more engaged with you, they can attend your events and programs and check out your website and all that kind of stuff, right?
Absolutely, we would love it if they did, and because and some of our best, most engaged members are the members who have come up through other organizations like yours. I mean, we just love that because they sort of have a better understanding of how organizational advocacy happens and how they can collectivize with others from their region, from their sector to sort of have a message. And I just think that, that it's been great to meet with you guys. When the chambers come to town with for your own meetings, we usually try to set aside some time to meet with you to figure out how we can help, what you're hearing, what your members are hearing, and I think that's just super productive to keep all those doors open. So we really appreciate your involvement.
Yeah, we've both been working in this business for a long time. What I find is there's a very small percentage of our members who get really fired up and want to get involved in the advocacy stuff. But what's cool about NSBA is we bring them together from all across the country and put them all in one room together. And man, that's an interesting discussion.
Yep, it definitely is.
Yep. So one more thing I want to ask about.
Yeah.
So you do you still do the annual Washington presentation where you bring folks in from across the country and
yes, we do
brief them and talk about that experience? Because that's a super
Yeah.
cool experience for anybody who's into policy and advocacy.
Yeah, we do that every single year. It's coming up this September 10th and 11th, which is the week after the Labor Day holiday. But yeah, but basically, we bring folks in. We also use it as the occasion to reveal and to honor our Small Business Advocate of the Year, which is recognized at an awards luncheon. Then we spend the afternoon in briefings. We often have a White House briefing. You can't promise it because you got to get them to do it and let us in over there.
Sure.
But we do that almost always. We've had the president come by a couple of times in the last few years. That's always a nice thing when that happens. But then we sort of brief them up on all the issues. We have a congressional breakfast up on the Hill the next morning where we bring in a bunch of members of Congress to talk about what they're doing and why and how it affects small companies. And then basically we let people loose on the Hill. We set up appointments for them with their representatives and senators. And they go up with our talking points and our priority issues and have those meetings and hopefully build relationships, because that's the most important thing, I think, for a small business that wants to be involved in advocacy, is not to think about any of this as a one-off. But the key is to use these occasions to build a relationship with a member of Congress. Yes, you need to have an ask, you need to have a reason to be there. Otherwise, they'll feel like you're wasting their time. But you need to think about that this is not going to be the last ask, that you need to meet with them when you're back home in the district and give them reasons to want to stay in touch with you as a connected small business leader who's connected to their local chamber, connected to national organizations, and someone who can sort of bring value and perspective to them. Give them a reason to want to reach out. I think that's super useful for all of us.
Well, and I love the way you equip people to have successful conversations. You help them get them set up, and then you sort of coach them through that a little bit, because it's not a natural thing to walk into a senator or a congressperson's office. No matter what you feel, you always sort of feel a little sense of awe when you're walking around those buildings. And you're talking to people who are setting policy for the country. So I think it's cool, but I think your point is great. It doesn't take a lot of visits with these folks to start to become a regular face to them and be somebody that, you can influence a little bit based on your stories and things like that. So I appreciate everything you do to help our folks be more effective. So if we get folks out to the September event, the Washington presentation, September 10th and 11th, tell me about, I love to ask people on the podcast about one of their Akron jams, but of course you're not, even though your business is, registered in Akron. You're not from Akron. Tell me about a place in DC that if I'm out there and I've got some time to kill, that you would highly recommend to check out that might not be on everybody's radar.
That's a good question. I mean, there's places like Le Diplomat, which I think has got on everybody's radar, but still a really good place to visit when you're out here. I would say, there's a new deli, and the owners are from Ohio, called Mikey and Mel's. It's a really fun place to
Nice.
visit downtown,
Okay.
and that's probably not on people's radar screens. And then uh, there's a place called Johnny's All American if you want a bar.
Okay.
And what's nice about that is you'd feel right at home because they call themselves kind of the embassy of Ohio. So they always have, Cavaliers, Browns, Guardians, whatever's going on from Ohio on the TV screens, and it's kind of a cool spot.
I love that. Thanks for tuning it to Ohio. I think that'll resonate well. You can feel like you're at home even when you're not in DC. Todd McCracken, the president and CEO of the National Small Business Association. Thanks for your work. Again, your website, www.nsbaadvocate.org, and we'll keep that in the link of the description of this of the podcast. But Todd, thanks for the work you're doing, the work of your organization, your long-term commitment to helping our small businesses.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Really appreciate you having me on here.